Welcome to Bite-Sized Battles. The sea hurled King Richard the Lionheart's small galley around as if it were nothing. The water of the Adriatic rose and fell with alarming speed, forming great white-crested mountains, the peaks from which the wooden ships screamed into dark, tumultuous valleys, threatening to engulf and annihilate. Richard and his small entourage of just 4 knights hung on for dear life. The Lionheart was as brave a man as any that has ever lived, but there is something so elementarily powerful about a heaving, storm-whipped ocean that widens the eyes and dries the mouth of even the most courageous. The men had tied themselves to railings and beams as colossal gusts of wind lashed their hair and tugged at their clothes, and the ocean swelled and thrashed as if churned by Poseidon himself. But it was to God that they prayed for deliverance. Was this storm the result of his anger at Richard's failure to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslim Sultan Saladin? If it was, God evidently decided Richard's punishment would be corporal, but not capital. The galley rowers roared every stroke of their oars, desperately trying to drag the ship away from what looked like death in the form of jagged rocks jutting from the sea. But just as the wind and waves looked as if they would drive them onto those teeth of death, the current suddenly took them leeward instead, past and away from the rocks, which now acted instead as a windbreak. Richard saw the opportunity and growled at the crew to make for the beach just discernible through the haze of lashing rain and sea spray. They barely made it, the galley being washed to land side on as the rowers collapsed from exhaustion. Bodies tumbled out as the boat tipped sideways onto the beach, hitting the surf and scrambling with whatever energy they had left as chests and oars clattered about them. Richard dragged himself a little way up the beach. He was sodden and cold in the November rain, but felt relief as he lay on the sand, breathing lungfuls of air. Later, he found his belongings amongst the wreckage, and as each one of his knights gathered around him, he contemplated his next move. But as the rush of survival ebbed away, Richard's reality came home to haunt him. He was a fugitive, trying to get back to England and his lands in Angevin, France, but without any safe way to do it. After offending nearly all the great lords of Europe, his enemies had closed most of the routes available to him. From the tip of southern Spain and Central Europe to southern France and the Byzantine Empire, Richard found hostile ports everywhere. His only hope had been to make for the northernmost point of the Adriatic, and from there to try to make it undetected to a brother-in-law duke in Bavaria. And even that would have taken him through the lands of another duke, Leopold II, who, you might remember from the last episode, he had gravely insulted in the Holy Land. Now, with his storm-wrecked ship lying ruined on the sand, Richard decided to stick with the plan, but with one tiny adjustment. He would have to walk the whole way. He had discarded most of the finery of kingship to try to travel incognito, disguised as a simple pilgrim. But he was being hunted, and he wouldn't get far. The consequences of what followed dominated all the years of the rest of Richard's life. I'm Andrew Mackenzie, this is Bite-Sized Battles, and welcome to the 4th episode of the Angevins, Lionheart Part 2, Dungeons and Death. And thanks to our friends, thegradsock.com, for making this episode possible. As Richard the Lionheart sailed away from the Holy Land a few days earlier, he looked back at its shores with the bitter taste of unfulfilled glory. He had come to recapture Jerusalem from the armies of Muslim Saracens and their cunning sultan, Saladin. But while he had come close enough to see the towering walls of the holy city itself, Richard had fallen agonizingly short. Richard galvanized the Third Crusade, bringing enough men, money and Angevin vigour to capture Acre within a month and go on to win at Arsuf and Jaffa too, besting Saladin each time. But his arrival had also divided and eventually seriously ruptured the whole enterprise. His catalogue of offences against fellow Christians went beyond even just the Crusade, to include the emperors of the Holy Roman and Byzantine empires, Henry VI and Isaac II. They were, let's say, cross at him for conquering Sicily and Cyprus respectively. He had insulted the Capetian king of France, Philip II, by refusing to share the spoils of war, backing out of his marriage to Philip's sister by bringing along an 18-year-old Spanish princess instead, and by being richer than he was. But perhaps the single most damaging thing Richard could have done, at least in the short term, had been to tear down the livery of Duke Leopold II of Austria, a lord of the Holy Roman Empire and a pivotal figure of the Third Crusade. Richard had found his allies' colours displayed at Acre's royal palace, but replaced them with his own, abruptly casting Leopold's down. As he watched his colours fall, Leopold vowed revenge for the humiliation. Within days, both Leopold and Philip had gone home in disgust. At first, Richard thought nothing of it. In fact, he'd been delighted. He was now the preeminent warrior of the Third Crusade. But after the successes at Arsuf and Jaffa, and with Jerusalem's high towers just in sight through the sun haze and dust, he got word from home, word that troubled his ear. Philip, ever the schemer, had returned to France and used Richard's absence to begin stirring up dissent amongst his Angevin vassals. And worst of all were the rumours of Richard's brother John. He had joined Philip's plots. Richard simply had too many enemies, and as more reports arrived of Philip and John actually invading his Angevin lands, taking his castles, sacking his towns, and even threatening England, Richard made the only choice he could. It was either leave now or risk being king in name only, his lands raped, suborned and conquered. So, in October 1192, he set sail for Europe. He had never met Saladin, but agreed a 3-year truce with him, promising he would return to continue where they had left off. Saladin's letters back promised a warm welcome. But within a year, Saladin would be dead, and in any case, Richard would never see the Holy Land again. After landing at Corfu, he learned just how dangerous his plight was. Word of his journey home had gone ahead of him, and even now the vultures were circling. Richard's enemies knew that between them, they controlled the lands and seas that Richard would have to travel. Philip of France and Leopold of Austria, the Holy Roman Henry and the Byzantine Isaac. All would have loved to get their hands on him. He dared not linger long in Corfu and sailed on quickly. That's when the storm hit. He had to run the gauntlet of the Byzantine coasts of what's now Turkey and Greece, and had managed to escape notice with just his small entourage and pilgrim's clothes. But now, with his enemies all around, Richard was shipwrecked and stranded somewhere on the eastern coast of the Adriatic. He had no choice but to continue on foot. He could not go south or east into Isaac's heartland. He could only turn north to try to reach his Bavarian brother-in-law. But that would take him right through the territory of Leopold, the man whose livery he had torn down in Acre. But what choice was there? There was nothing for it, so they set off north. And Richard, ever the adventurous gambler, had taken the decision to walk straight to the Austrian capital of Vienna. Great gambles like this had always paid off for Richard, from Messina to Cyprus and Acre to Jaffa. At Jaffa, Richard had sailed at night and against the wind to reach the city which had just fallen to Saladin. Landing, he had led a furious attack which had taken the Saracens completely by surprise, scattering them with crossbow fire and bellows of rage. When the Muslims returned, Richard again led a counterattack of knights in hedgehog formation, pouring crossbow bolts into the Saracen ranks before charging in with sword and axe. Saladin's men had turned and run. Again and again, Richard had taken big risks and seen them pay off. But by going straight to Vienna, he wasn't hoping to pull off some insane assault, but to hide in plain sight. On balance, it seemed a good plan. Genuine pilgrims would often head to Vienna, a major city and stopping point. Richard mused that his enemies would assume he would avoid the city, so by going to the centre of Leopold's power, Richard hoped to hide from it altogether amongst the throngs of humanity there. But Richard's risk caught up with him just 50 miles from the city. It's not clear exactly what happened. Some say his party, supposed to be poor, penitent pilgrims, was caught flaunting a little too much money in a local alehouse. Other stories go that someone noticed a very expensive and regal-looking ring that Richard had refused to part with when he donned his disguise. However it happened, someone spotted him and raised the alarm. Before long, Richard was arrested and hauled before a gleeful, gloating Duke Leopold of Austria. Lording it over his English rival, Leopold took every opportunity to bask in the glory of imprisoning the King of England and Lord of the Angevin Empire. The humiliation of having his livery torn down by the Lionheart and Acre still stung. He wasn't cruel to Richard. He was still a king and a crusader, so notions of noble chivalry meant Richard was kept under house arrest rather than thrown into the dungeons. But nonetheless, he was Leopold's prisoner, and the Austrian loved it. Quickly, though, Leopold decided to cash in. But it wasn't to England that he ransomed Richard, but to Henry VI, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Henry didn't view this as a ransom, and he certainly didn't do it out of the kindness of his heart. Henry spent his silver buying Richard, a man he saw as a fugitive, because not only was Henry angry at Richard's assault on Sicily, he also blamed him for a brutal murder just months earlier. The murder of the new King of Jerusalem, Conrad of Montferrat. Alongside upsetting the French, Leopold and everyone else while on crusade, Richard had also got involved in the squabbles about who would rule the rump of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Still a kingdom, despite Jerusalem itself being in Saladin's hands. Richard had wanted his man Guy de Lusignan as king, but in April 1192 it was the French and Holy Roman pick, Conrad of Montferrat, who was elected instead. But Conrad was only to be king for a matter of days. As Conrad rode home from an entertaining dinner party on the night of 28th of April 1192, he was flanked by a pair of guards, but felt little need of their protection. He was finally King of Jerusalem, after a long and successful career in the Holy Land. Down one particularly narrow street, he approached two men sat either side of the road. He paid them no attention until they stood up suddenly, one offering him a letter. Intrigued, Conrad leaned down to take it. He didn't even see the long-bladed knife in the other man's hand suddenly whip upwards and into his throat, blood suddenly spraying out. Panicked screams gurgled from his mouth as the other man jumped up behind him and stabbed him in the side. Conrad slumped from the saddle as his life pumped and gushed into the street. It had all happened in the flash of a moment, but now his guards howled their anger, drawing swords and rushing Conrad's attackers. One assassin was killed on the spot, the other traced to a nearby church and then executed by dragging him through the streets. He told them little before he died, but it was clear the two men were members of the infamous order of Hashashin, otherwise known as the Assassins. This secretive and feared order was responsible for dozens of high-profile assassinations of powerful men over hundreds of years. But while it was the assassins who buried their blades in Conrad's body, it was widely rumoured that Richard the Lionheart had paid them to put them there. And now the Holy Roman Emperor wanted to prove it. He put Richard on trial, hoping that Richard's guilt would be obvious for all to see. It's not clear what he hoped the outcome of this guilt would be. Perpetual imprisonment, languishing in a German dungeon, even execution of an English king. It would have been shocking and tantamount to war. Whatever was in Henry's mind, we'll never know, because according to an eyewitness at his trial, William the Breton, Richard spoke so eloquently and regally, in so lion-hearted a manner, it was as though he was seated on an ancestral throne at Lincoln or Caen. Henry's fury could not stop his Holy Roman lords acquitting Richard of the crime of Conrad's murder. But that did not mean Henry simply let Richard go. Instead, he demanded 150,000 marks as a ransom, a colossal sum that eclipsed the cost even of Richard's huge contribution to the Third Crusade. It amounted to perhaps 3 times the annual income of the English crown. This was a time of medieval shuttle diplomacy, with negotiators, ambassadors and diplomats of several nations criss-crossing Europe in a feverish contest to decide Richard's fate. English Angevins and French Capetians argued furiously at the emperor's court. Papal diplomats tried in vain to find a compromise which would satisfy all. But with the English wanting immediate release, the French demanding indefinite imprisonment, and the emperor not backing down on the ransom, it became clear that diplomacy would fail. England would have to find a way to pay, or its king, the mighty Richard the Lionheart, would be kept in a German prison until the end of his days. And every day he was kept banged up, his brother John and Philip II were carving up Angevin territories in France for themselves. Of course, Richard's mother, the fierce and respected Eleanor of Aquitaine, led the fundraising, along with Richard's trusted lieutenants across the Angevin realm. But it wouldn't be easy. Already squeezed by the demands of the Crusade, England was subjected to a gut-punching 25% tax on all income and movable goods. Everyone, from the great lords and bishops down to the merchants and peasants of every town and village of England, were forced to pay. Nobles contributed 1/4 of their annual income. Churches and monasteries gave wagon loads of silver and treasure. Cistercian monks handed over an entire year's worth of valuable wool crop, and merchants were tapped at every port and market. It took 6 months to raise, and in the meantime, Richard sat languishing, sometimes in good spirits, sometimes lamenting that his countrymen had abandoned him. He even wrote a song about it, Janus Empire. You can look it up, it's a banger. But on the 4th of February 1194, after a Herculean effort, England paid Emperor Henry VI 100,000 marks and gave hostages for 50,000 more. And despite John and Philip II offering another 80,000 marks in an extraordinary last-ditch attempt to have Richard kept in prison until the end of the year, Henry was satisfied and released the Angevin king. Hearing this, Philip II wrote urgently to John, "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." Richard travelled first to London, where he was celebrated by a jubilant crowd of lords, priests and ordinary townsfolk. It was important that Richard symbolically reclaim his kingship through the ceremony, but he knew he needed to do more than that. John and Philip had been claiming territory in Normandy, Anjou and Aquitaine, and John had even convinced some of the English lords to support him. So Richard got to work in the fashion he knew best. Swapping crown and robes for helm and mail, he led forces against English castles and towns that had sworn for John, hanged rebels, confiscated estates, and replaced dozens of fickle sheriffs with his own loyal men. This was a very real re-stamping of the Lionheart's authority on England, almost instantly snuffing out John's embers of English rebellion. With that accomplished, Richard made immediately for Normandy. The Angevin Empire in France had been crumbling in his absence, picked at and torn apart by his treacherous brother and the rapaciousness of a vindictive Philip II. The time had come to take it back. The task at hand, though, was formidable. When John had assumed the Angevin crown for himself, he signed away to Philip great swathes of Normandy, and granted vital castles in Touraine and, most importantly, Gisors. The castle at Gisors was one of the greatest in all of France, a Motte and Bailey fortress cast in stone, with huge walls and imposing defences. Since the days of Henry II, it had guarded the critically strategic position between Capetian Paris and Angevin Rouen, and defended the most important borderlands of Western Europe. Richard, then, had his eye on Gisors. But first, what to do with John? Nearly immediately, John had come crawling back to Richard, begging forgiveness and that he hadn't meant it, really. The meeting had been orchestrated by the men's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as had what happened next. Richard raised John up, kissed him and said, "John, have no fear. You are a child." He was 27, by the way. "And you have had bad men looking after you. Those who thought to give you bad advice will get their deserts. Get up and go and eat." A little patronising, perhaps, but John wasn't exactly in a position to object. Indeed, he was so enthusiastic about his forgiveness that he rode to the town of Evreux, where the French garrison didn't know he had switched sides. That is, until he started cutting their throats. It's surprising that Richard forgave John so quickly, even if it had been at the behest of his mother. But it's likely he reasoned that as devious as John was, it was better to have him on side and in his debt than as an enemy. Either way, with the John issue resolved, Richard now embarked in earnest on a war the great knight and lord William Marshal described as fierce and dangerous. Since he'd returned from Crusade, Philip had seized the rich Flemish country of Artois, making the French king considerably richer than he had been, and he used these resources to keep Richard on the move. Up and down the Angevin Empire in France, Philip led or sponsored forces that would drag Richard around his lands, in the hope he would become worn down by exhaustion and attrition. But Philip had forgotten that Richard was Henry II's son, a man brimming with inexhaustible energy. Siege followed siege, knights fought each other in great real-life versions of the tournaments they all so loved, and alliances shifted like sand. William Marshal recalled one battle in which he alone had fought his way onto the battlements of Milly Castle and exhausted himself so much with killing that he could only defeat the castle's constable by sitting on him. Richard inexorably kept winning. He turned many of Philip's vassals and allies against him, and when he finally turned his eye back to the castle at Gisors, he decided instead of besieging it, he'd just build his own. A magnificent and mighty new castle to dominate the Norman borderlands, the great Château Gaillard. Richard now began to rove and reeve. Riding in 2 columns in late September 1198, the Angevins managed to capture 3 castles in one day. The momentum was most certainly with the Lionheart, and Philip knew it. He had to turn the tide. Philip decided he first needed to reinforce the garrison at the castle of Courcelles, and rode hard for it with 300 knights as well as a host of mounted sergeants and men-at-arms. What Philip was unaware of, though, was that it had already fallen to the English. Richard, who was personally patrolling with one of his columns, heard of Richard's approach and called together his men for an ambush. But something must have spooked Philip, because he turned suddenly away from Courcelles and made instead for the castle at Gisors at pace. The ambush then turned into a hunt. Richard and his men moved at speed. 200 knights and hundreds of men-at-arms raced to intercept the French. Both groups of mounted men, Capetian and Angevin, raced for the river Eth, now Ep.4, which was spanned by a single bridge, over which were the gates to Gisors Castle. Make it there first, and the French would be safe. Philip and his men hurried. Whatever had spooked them, they knew hunters were on their tail. When the bridge across the Eth came within sight, the French released their collective breath in relief, making immediately for the safety of the castle beyond. But they had barely begun to cross when the distant rumble of hooves shook the ground and air behind them. They had been found. Without warning, and with horns blaring and the great shouts of men falling upon their prey, Richard and his knights launched themselves down a low hill at the centre of a milling mass of Frenchmen waiting to cross the bridge. There were whoops of joy from the Angevins to see Philip turn in his saddle, eyes wide with shock and panic. Even so, Capetian orders rang out to meet the oncoming charge, and French knights turned to spur their horses into the fray, with great clumps of earth flung from scrambling hooves. For an onlooker, there must have been a second or two before the two sides came together, a sight of hundreds of knights flying gleefully at each other, with shouts and curses and horns, the banners and pennants of English red and French blue flicking in the wind, feeling the ground shake under the assault of thousands of hooves. And then the spell would have been brutally broken, as iron-clothed men and horses battered together in a crunching, cacophonous thunder of lances, swords, and death. Screams rang out as the first men were hacked and chopped from the saddle, banners falling to the mud with their owners. Almost immediately the ferocity of the Angevin charge told. The French, while brave and skilled, had been surprised, and their countercharge hadn't had the time or a downhill slope to pick up enough speed. In short, they quailed and began to falter. Richard himself scythed through his opponents, unhorsing 3 knights as the men around him did the same, the warm English knife to the soft French butter. The French falter turned quickly to panic and then to rout, as the English swarmed among them, seeming to bring them down at will. Routs are always an almost instant affair, and suddenly French knights and men-at-arms were racing for the single wooden bridge across the Eth. Philip was among them, his bodyguards trying in vain to shield him from the crush. Hundreds of men, many still mounted, crammed themselves onto the now groaning bridge, desperate for the safety of the other side. But shuddering under the weight, the bridge first creaked, then loudly buckled, and finally abruptly collapsed, throwing dozens of armoured French knights into the water. The King of France, Philip II, was one of them. He felt the bridge roll and then quickly just go, felt the terror of falling and then felt the cold water engulf him. Dragged under by the weight of his armour, he sank like a stone to the riverbed, where the water rushed in his ears, nearly drowning out the desperate muffled shouts of men from the surface. The air had been driven from him by the fall, and lungs beginning to burn, he tried to rise, but found he couldn't. He began to thrash about, trying frantically to get a hold of something, anything, to help him out to that beautiful air, just inches away. But nothing. There was nothing to help him, and as deep, deep terror filled his heart, his body finally forced him to inhale, filling his lungs with water. Retching to remove it made it worse. The river Eth was claiming him. Just as a strange calm began to descend upon Philip, he lurched suddenly upwards, strong hands gripping and dragging him. He heard the water drain from his ears and the irresistible urge to violently spew and cough as the river gushed from his mouth and lungs. Philip II was alive, just, and was dragged away to the safety of Gisors, as the Angevins bellowed taunts and insults. Unable to cross the river in pursuit, they reconciled themselves with an unexpectedly rich victory, capturing at least 100 high-value knights, as many again men-at-arms, and 200 precious French chargers. Richard wrote mockingly afterwards that Philip had had to drink of the river and that victory was a gift of God and my right. In French it goes Dieu est mon droit, and Richard quickly adopted it as his motto. It remains the motto of the British monarch to this day. Philip was clearly rocked by the event, and with little news to cheer him from elsewhere, soon invited Richard for peace talks. He offered to return all of Richard's lands, castles and rights to him, except for Gisors, whose fate would be decided upon by a jury of 12 barons, 6 Norman and 6 French. Richard refused, saying Gisors was his by right. We'll never know the outcome of this wrangling, though, because while Richard raced off to the next challenge and probably expected to return to a compliant Philip, he never did return. A small revolt had broken out at Châlus-Chabrol in Aquitaine, centred on its diminutive castle, whose garrison numbered just 40 men and women. And while it might have seemed a minor distraction suitable for one of Richard's trusted captains to deal with, the castle's position on the border between Angevin Aquitaine and France made it strategically vital to the English king. Richard himself set out for it at once. When Richard arrived, he must have felt confident as he inspected the castle's defences. This was a man who had fought at Acre and Jaffa, had seen the mighty castles of the Holy Roman Empire, and had organised the building of the huge and beautiful Château Gaillard. Châlus-Chabrol was a child's toy in comparison. He wanted a quick siege, expecting that the garrison would surrender when they saw who had come to them personally. But they did not, and for 3 days the defenders defied Richard's sappers and siege engines. It was in the growing dusk of the 3rd day that it happened. Richard left his tent carrying a crossbow and oblong shield, but no armour save an iron helmet. All was quiet in the half-light of the gathering night, the sun already gone below the horizon, leaving red streaking the clouds. He gazed at the battlements, almost admiring the courage and determination of the defenders. Just as he did, there was a flicker of movement, a shadow between 2 of the crenellations. A man we now know was named Peter Basilius had been crouching beneath them in the gloom. He had spotted figures roaming beneath the castle and fancied his chances. Lifting an iron frying pan he had taken from the kitchens as a makeshift shield with one hand, he swept up a crossbow with the other. The men were just silhouettes, but they formed a group, and he felt sure he could hit one of them. Taking a breath, he popped up above the wall, levelled the crossbow, and loosed a bolt as fast as he could. It disappeared into the shadows, speeding towards the men below. Richard heard the crack of a crossbow, looked up, and saw the bolt too late in the dark. It struck him hard, plunging 6 inches into his left shoulder and sent him staggering back several paces. But he did not cry out. He was a king and would not give his enemy a reason to cheer or his men to concern. He simply turned around and walked back to his tent. In the candlelight he tried to pull the bolt out, but succeeded only in snapping the shaft close to the skin, leaving the barb buried deep in his flesh. Richard knew it hadn't hit any major arteries or organs, but it was still at the bottom of a bad wound and needed to be removed, and soon. A surgeon was summoned, but medieval battlefield surgery was a grisly and difficult business at the best of times, let alone once night had fallen. A full fire was made to give light to the operation, but it was still almost impossible for the surgeon to properly see what he was doing. He dug around in Richard's shoulder, going deeper and deeper in search for the lump of metal lodged painfully in his body. Finally, he found it, and Richard was bandaged up. But the wound would not heal. Instead, it festered and soon turned gangrenous, the infection beginning to spread throughout Richard's upper body. 10 days after the king had been struck by the crossbow bolt, Richard's mother, the now elderly Eleanor of Aquitaine, rushed to her favourite son's bedside. Richard spoke comforting words to her and publicly forgave Peter Basilius, the castle defender who had struck him down. Shortly afterwards, Richard, the indomitable Lionheart, died. Richard's death was a profound loss for England, and the ripple effects of his passing would be felt for generations. With Richard gone, Philip II felt his confidence return. He could dominate the man who was now set to inherit the English throne, John. The peace Philip had offered Richard would never be offered again, and soon Philip would earn himself an epithet of glory, Augustus. Under John's rule, the Angevin Empire would face its cataclysm, a collapse that has always left the ultimate question of what if lingering even to this day. Richard's reign was marked by warfare, glory, and conquest. He had earned a reputation as one of the greatest warrior kings in history, a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. But he was also a king who spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, a king whose pursuit of glory on foreign battlefields came at a tremendous cost to his realm. Yet even in death, Richard the Lionheart's legend grew. The stories of his deeds have echoed through the ages, inspiring generations of knights, kings, and even ordinary people in the 21st century. His was a life of adventure, triumph, and tragedy. And though his reign ended in unfulfilled promise, Richard's name would forever be remembered as one of the greatest kings of England. His brother John would go down as one of the worst. Join us next time to find out how King John single-handedly lost the Angevin Empire his father and brother had built, and how he managed to incite his English barons to a rebellion so great it would lead to one of the greatest political documents of all time, Magna Carta. Thank you for listening. See you then. You can follow Bite-Sized Battles on Instagram, and if you can, contribute to our Patreon through the link in our bio.